My son told me, "I'll pay you back for everything," when he was 12, and I laughed it off until 15 years later. Liam said it standing in our kitchen with tears streaming down his face, holding the eviction notice I'd tried to hide from him. He was 12 years old and small for his age, wearing a t-shirt with a hole in the collar because we couldn't afford new clothes. I just explained that we had 30 days to find somewhere else to live, that the landlord had finally lost patience with my late rent payments, that we'd be moving again for the third time in 2 years. My son looked at me with those serious dark eyes that had seen too much poverty for his age and made a promise I knew he couldn't keep. "Mom, when I grow up, I'll pay you back for everything. For all the times you chose between feeding me and paying bills. For every time you worked double shifts and came home exhausted, for every sacrifice you made, I promise I'll make it right." His voice cracked on the last word, and I pulled him into a hug, my heart breaking because he was 12 and shouldn't be carrying guilt about our poverty, shouldn't be making promises about fixing problems that weren't his fault. I laughed gently and told him he didn't owe me anything, that being my son was enough, that his job was just to be a kid and do well in school. But I saw something in his expression that unsettled me, a determination that seemed too old for his face. He wasn't making the kind of empty promise kids make when they feel helpless. He was making a vow, committing to something with the kind of intensity that scared me a little. I dismissed it as childhood dramatics, and we packed our belongings into garbage bags for the third move in 24 months, relocating to a cheaper apartment in a worse neighborhood because my restaurant hostess salary couldn't stretch any further. The years after that were hard in ways that ground us down slowly. I worked 2 jobs, hostess at a restaurant during evenings and hotel housekeeping during mornings. Sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, Liam raised himself in many ways, learning to cook simple meals by age 13, doing his own laundry, walking himself to school because I was always at one job or another. He never complained, never demanded things other kids had, never made me feel worse about our situation than I already did. He just studied relentlessly and worked part-time jobs as soon as he was old enough, saving every penny. When Liam was 16, he came home with a black eye and split lip that he tried to hide from me. I cornered him in the bathroom while he was cleaning the blood off his face and demanded the truth. He'd gotten into a fight at school defending another kid from bullies, and the principal had suspended him for 3 days, despite witnesses confirming he'd been protecting someone smaller. The suspension meant he'd missed the state academic competition he'd been preparing for all year, the one with scholarship money attached that he desperately needed for college. I called the school begging them to reconsider, explaining that Liam was a good kid who'd been defending someone, but they refused to budge on the suspension policy. I watched my son's face when I told him the competition was impossible now, watched something harden in his expression that I'd never seen before. He didn't cry or rage or blame anyone. He just nodded once and said, "It's fine," in a voice that made clear it wasn't fine at all. That evening, I found him at his desk working through calculus problems with his split lip still swollen, and I felt this overwhelming helplessness wash over me. I couldn't fix the suspension, couldn't afford a lawyer to fight it, couldn't do anything except keep working my 2 jobs and hope things eventually got better. They didn't get better. 3 months later, I was fired from the hotel housekeeping job because I'd missed too many shifts. I'd been missing them because I was dealing with a health issue I couldn't afford to properly diagnose or treat, stomach pains that sometimes doubled me over but which I'd been ignoring because doctor visits cost money we didn't have. The restaurant kept me on but cut my hours, and suddenly we were drowning financially in ways we'd managed to avoid before the cheap apartment we'd moved to had developed a black mold problem the landlord refused to address, and Liam's childhood asthma flared up so badly he landed in the emergency room twice in 1 month. The hospital bills were catastrophic even with the charity care discount. I'd never carried health insurance because the premiums were impossible on my income, and now I owed $17,000 for 2 emergency room visits and follow-up care. The billing department called constantly with increasingly threatening messages about payment plans and collections. I stopped answering the phone and started having panic attacks when mail arrived because it was always bills, always demands for money I didn't have and couldn't imagine ever having. Liam graduated high school with a 3.9 GPA, despite everything. Despite the moves and the poverty and the black mold apartment, and missing that scholarship competition, he'd worked part-time through junior and senior year at a grocery store, saving every cent toward college. He'd applied to state universities with good financial aid, gotten accepted to 3, chosen the one with the best scholarship package. I was proud and heartbroken simultaneously because his scholarship covered tuition but not housing or books or living expenses, and I had nothing to give him. He'd saved $4,000 from his grocery store job, and that was all we had between us. The night before Liam left for college, he sat me down at our kitchen table in the mold apartment and tried to give me $2,000 of his $4,000. I refused absolutely, nearly shouting at him that I wouldn't take money he needed for textbooks and food. He argued that I needed it more, that my stomach problems were getting worse and I needed to see a doctor, that the hospital bills were crushing me. We fought about it until we were both crying, and finally I made him promise to keep all $4,000 for himself, to focus on his education and not worry about me. "I'll be fine," I told him, lying through my teeth because I wasn't fine and we both knew it. "You just focus on school and becoming someone who doesn't have to live like this." Liam looked at me with those same intense eyes from when he was 12, and I saw him war with himself about saying something before apparently deciding against it. He hugged me and left the next morning for university, and I cried for 3 hours after he was gone because the apartment felt empty in ways that were suffocating. College was supposed to be where things turned around for Liam, where his intelligence and work ethic finally paid off. But 2 months into his freshman year, I got a call from university police saying he'd been arrested. The charge was theft, specifically stealing expensive laboratory equipment from the chemistry building. The detective explained they had security footage showing Liam entering the lab late at night and leaving with a backpack full of equipment worth several $1,000s. They'd found the equipment in his dorm room, along with emails he'd written trying to sell it online. I drove the 3 hours to the university in a state of shock because my son wasn't a thief, had never stolen anything in his life. When I saw him in the holding cell, he looked exhausted and defeated in ways that made him seem decades older. The full story came out slowly. His roommate had stolen the equipment and hidden it in their shared room, had used Liam's computer to send the selling emails. Liam had discovered it and confronted his roommate, who'd then planted more evidence and called campus police claiming Liam was the thief. The security footage was ambiguous enough that it could have been either of them in the dark hallway. Liam's roommate came from a wealthy family with connections to the university administration. His father was a major donor and board member. Liam was a scholarship kid with no resources and no connections. Despite Liam's insistence on his innocence, despite character witnesses from professors, the university expelled him pending criminal charges. The criminal charges themselves were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the expulsion stood. The university's student conduct board ruled that Liam had violated their honor code and could not return to campus. I spent every cent I had on a lawyer who ultimately couldn't do anything, because private universities have broad discretion in disciplinary matters. Liam's scholarship was revoked, his transcript marked with the expulsion, his college career destroyed before it really started. He came back to our mold apartment and got his old job back at the grocery store, working full-time and saving money with some vague plan to reapply to different universities eventually. But I watched the light drain from his eyes over the following months, watched him become quietly bitter in ways that scared me. 6 months after the expulsion, my stomach problems became acute enough that I collapsed at work and was rushed to the emergency room. The tests revealed advanced colon cancer that had been growing untreated for over a year, the stomach pains I'd been ignoring finally manifesting as something that couldn't be dismissed. The oncologist explained I'd need surgery followed by aggressive chemotherapy, months of treatment that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, even with charity care programs. Without treatment, I had maybe 6 months to live. With treatment, my 5-year survival rate was 40%. I chose to forego treatment. The decision wasn't dramatic or brave, it was simple mathematics. Treatment would bankrupt us completely and still probably kill me within 5 years. No treatment meant I died faster but left Liam without crushing medical debt, gave him a chance to eventually rebuild his life. I told him I was declining treatment because I was tired, because 40% odds weren't good enough, because I wanted to spend my remaining time living rather than suffering through chemo. He begged me to reconsider, broke down crying in ways I hadn't seen since he was small. But I was firm, and Liam eventually stopped arguing, though I caught him researching experimental treatments and alternative therapies with desperate focus. He started working additional hours at the grocery store like he was trying to save enough money to change my mind about treatment. I wanted to tell him to stop, to accept what was coming and focus on his own future, but I didn't have the heart to take away whatever hope was keeping him going. We fell into a routine where he worked constantly, and I grew progressively weaker, both of us pretending things weren't as dire as they obviously were. 4 months after my diagnosis, Liam came home at midnight looking different in ways I couldn't immediately identify. He was carrying himself with new confidence or maybe defiance, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and placed a bank envelope in front of me, the kind they use for large withdrawals. I opened it confused and found $50,000 in bundled hundreds, more money than I'd seen in my entire life accumulated in one place. What is this? Liam, what did you do? My voice came out panicked because there was no legitimate way my 19-year-old son working at a grocery store had $50,000. He met my eyes calmly and explained in a flat voice that he'd been working a second job I didn't know about, something that paid much better than grocery store wages. When I demanded details, he simply said it was private security work and declined to elaborate further. I knew immediately he was lying but couldn't imagine what the truth might be. Private security didn't pay well enough to save $50,000 in 4 months, not for a 19-year-old with no experience or training. The money felt wrong in my hands, tainted with whatever Liam had done to obtain it. I tried to give it back and he refused to take it, his expression hardening into something I barely recognized. That's for your treatment. Cancer treatment, the best doctors we can find, whatever you need. It's not negotiable. I started crying and demanding to know what he'd done, whether he'd stolen it, whether he was in danger. Liam's expression softened slightly and he took my hands in his. Mom, remember when I was 12 and promised I'd pay you back for everything? I meant it. This is me keeping that promise. The money is clean, it's mine, and you're going to use it to save your life. The way he said it made clear the conversation was over, that he wouldn't explain further regardless of how much I pushed. I took the money because I wanted to live, because $50,000 meant maybe I could afford treatment, because my son had somehow found a way to save me, when the system had failed us completely. I started chemotherapy the following week at a cancer center that accepted payment plans, using Liam's mysterious money to cover initial costs and ongoing treatments. The first month was brutal, the chemo making me sicker than the cancer had, but the oncologist was optimistic about my response to treatment. Liam kept working his grocery store job and his other mysterious job, coming home late most nights and refusing to discuss details. I tried to track his movements, follow him once, but he noticed immediately and asked me to trust him. "I'm not doing anything that will come back on you," he said firmly. "I'm being smart and careful. Just focus on getting better." The reassurance didn't actually reassure me, but I was too weak from chemo to fight him properly. 3 months into treatment, federal agents showed up at our apartment at 6 in the morning. They had a warrant to search the premises and questions about Liam's activities over the past several months. The lead agent, a woman named Special Agent Delgado, explained that Liam had been under surveillance for possible involvement in a cybercrime operation. They'd tracked him to an online marketplace where he was allegedly selling stolen data, using sophisticated encryption to hide his identity. They hadn't arrested him yet because they were still building their case, but they wanted to know what I knew about his activities. I knew nothing, I told them truthfully, my hands shaking as agents tore apart our tiny apartment looking for evidence. Agent Delgado seemed to believe my ignorance but warned me that Liam was likely involved in serious federal crimes that carried lengthy prison sentences. They'd been monitoring his online activities and bank accounts, had evidence linking him to data breaches at several major corporations. The money he'd given me was probably proceeds from selling corporate data on black market forums. After the agents left, I sat in the destroyed apartment and felt my world collapse inward. My son had become a cyber criminal to pay for my cancer treatment, had committed federal crimes that could send him to prison for years, had sacrificed his freedom and future to save my life. The $50,000 suddenly felt like blood money, like I'd been complicit in destroying him by accepting it. When Liam came home that evening, I confronted him with everything Agent Delgado had said. He didn't deny anything. He sat down calmly and explained in technical terms. I barely understood that he'd taught himself advanced computer programming and hacking over the past year. He'd identified security vulnerabilities in corporate systems, exploited them to access sensitive data, and sold that data to buyers who paid premium prices. He'd been careful, used encryption and anonymizing tools, moved money through cryptocurrency. He'd thought he was being untraceable, but apparently the FBI was better at tracking cybercriminals than he'd anticipated. "I knew it was illegal," Liam said without emotion. "I knew I might get caught. But you were dying, and I couldn't let that happen when I had the skills to prevent it. You gave up everything for me my entire childhood. I wasn't going to let you give up your life too." The logic was insane and heartbreaking simultaneously. My 19-year-old son had committed federal crimes out of love, had risked his freedom because I'd sacrificed too much for him over too many years. I begged him to stop immediately, to return whatever money he still had, to cooperate with federal agents and hope for leniency. Liam shook his head and explained calmly that he'd already sold the most valuable data and hidden the proceeds in ways that would be difficult to trace. He had enough money set aside to cover my full treatment course, including surgery, enough to pay off the old hospital bills that had been crushing us for years, enough to ensure I'd be financially stable even if he went to prison. "You're going to beat this cancer," he said with absolute certainty, "and then you're going to live comfortably for the first time in your life. That's non-negotiable." The federal case against Liam developed over the following months while I continued chemotherapy treatments I couldn't have afforded without his criminal proceeds. The irony was devastating. Every chemo session paid for with money from data breaches and corporate espionage. Agent Delgado kept in contact, updating me on the investigation's progress, telling me they were close to making arrests. She seemed sympathetic to our situation, but made clear that Liam's motives wouldn't excuse the crimes he'd committed. 6 months into my treatment, the oncologist declared me in remission. The cancer had responded better than anyone expected to the aggressive chemotherapy, the tumors shrinking until they were undetectable on scans I'd survived when 40% odds suggested I wouldn't, had beaten cancer because my son had committed federal crimes to pay for treatment the healthcare system wouldn't provide. The victory felt hollow when I knew Liam's arrest was coming, when every day I waited for federal agents to take him away in handcuffs. The arrest happened on a Monday morning when Liam was leaving for his grocery store shift. A team of agents surrounded him in the parking lot, reading him his rights while neighbors watched from windows. I ran outside in my bathrobe and watched them load him into a federal vehicle, his face calm and resigned like he'd been expecting this for months. Agent Delgado approached me gently and explained he was being charged with multiple counts of computer fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud, crimes carrying potential sentences of decades in federal prison. The bail hearing was a nightmare. The prosecutor argued Liam was a sophisticated cyber criminal with skills and resources to flee, recommended he be held without bail. Pending trial, Liam's public defender was overwhelmed and ineffective, barely mounting a defense. The judge set bail at $200,000, an impossible amount that might as well have been $2 million. Liam would sit in federal detention until trial, which could be months away given court backlogs. I used some of Liam's hidden money to hire a real lawyer, a criminal defense attorney named Jeffrey Huang who specialized in cybercrime cases. Huang reviewed the evidence and told me bluntly that the federal case was strong. They had digital forensics linking Liam to multiple breaches, had traced cryptocurrency transactions, had testimony from buyers who'd purchased stolen data from him. The prosecutor was offering a plea deal of 12 years in federal prison in exchange for cooperation identifying other members of the online criminal marketplace where he'd sold data. That 12 years meant Liam would be 31 when released, meant his 20s would be spent in prison for crimes committed to save my life. I couldn't accept it. Couldn't let my son sacrifice his freedom for my survival. I asked Huang what options existed beyond the plea deal, and he explained that going to trial was risky, juries were unsympathetic to hackers, and Liam could receive an even longer sentence if convicted at trial. But Huang also mentioned that judges had discretion in sentencing, that demonstrating compelling circumstances might result in lighter sentences than guidelines suggested. The trial preparation consumed months while Liam sat in detention. Huang built a defense strategy around the circumstances that led to Liam's crimes, the medical bills and denied treatment and systemic failures that pushed a desperate teenager into illegal activity. He wanted to present evidence of my cancer diagnosis, the hospital bills, the insurance denial, everything that demonstrated Liam had acted out of love rather than greed. The prosecutor fought to exclude that evidence as irrelevant to guilt, but the judge allowed limited testimony about circumstances and motive. I testified at trial about our financial struggles, about being unable to afford basic health care, about watching my son carry guilt for poverty that wasn't his fault. I explained through tears how I'd chosen to forego cancer treatment because the cost would financially destroy any chance Liam had at a future. I described finding $50,000 on my kitchen table and knowing immediately that my son had done something terrible to save me. The jury listened with expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort to judgment. Liam testified too, explaining in technical detail how he'd learned to hack corporate systems, how he'd identified vulnerabilities and exploited them, how he'd sold data for amounts that seemed impossible to someone who'd grown up in poverty. He didn't show remorse for the hacking itself, but made clear his motivation was singular and desperate. I watched my mother choose death over bankruptcy. I watched the healthcare system tell her she wasn't worth saving unless she had money, so I found a way to get money, and I don't regret it because she's alive. The victims testified about damages from the data breaches, about customers whose information had been compromised, about costs of security improvements and legal settlements. The corporations he'd targeted had suffered millions in damages collectively, though Liam had personally profited around $90,000 total. The disparity between his take and their losses highlighted how data breaches worked, how small operators could cause enormous damage while keeping relatively modest proceeds. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, and Huang prepared submissions arguing for downward departure from sentencing guidelines based on extraordinary circumstances. He gathered letters of support from my oncologist, from former teachers who described Liam's character before desperation pushed him into crime, from community members who knew our family's struggles. He presented evidence of systemic failures in healthcare and social services, arguing that society bore responsibility for creating conditions where a teenager felt crime was his only option. The sentencing hearing was surreal. The prosecutor argued for 15 years, pointing to the sophistication of Liam's crimes and the need for deterrence. Huang argued for probation with restitution, emphasizing Liam's age, lack of criminal history, and compelling motivation. The judge listened to both sides and to testimony from victims and supporters before taking a recess to consider the appropriate sentence. When court reconvened, the judge addressed Liam directly. "Mr. Brennan, you committed serious crimes that harmed innocent people and violated the trust essential to our digital economy. Your technical skills and intelligence make these crimes worse, not better, because you knew exactly what you were doing and chose to do it anyway. However, I also understand the circumstances that led to your choices. I understand what it means to watch a parent suffer and feel powerless to help. I understand the moral calculus that led you to conclude corporate data was worth less than your mother's life." The judge continued, explaining that the sentence had to balance punishment with recognition of extraordinary circumstances. "I'm sentencing you to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will also pay restitution to the affected companies in an amount to be determined. This sentence is below guidelines because I believe your crimes were situational rather than character-based, and because I believe you can be rehabilitated and become a productive member of society. But make no mistake, you're going to prison, and you're going to serve time for the serious crimes you committed. 5 years was better than 12 or 15, but still devastating." Liam would be 24 when released, his early 20s spent in federal prison. I sobbed throughout the rest of the hearing, feeling responsible for every day he'd spend locked away. After the judge dismissed court, I had 5 minutes to speak with Liam before marshals took him away. He hugged me and told me he'd be fine, that 5 years was manageable, that I needed to focus on staying healthy and living the life he'd fought to preserve. "You didn't owe me this," I said through tears. "You never owed me anything." Liam smiled sadly and replied, "I told you when I was 12 that I'd pay you back for everything. I kept my promise. even if the cost was higher than either of us expected. The marshals separated us then and led him away, and I stood in the courtroom feeling like I'd failed fundamentally as a parent by letting my son sacrifice himself for me. The years while Liam served his sentence were strange and painful. I stayed cancer-free, the remission holding strong, my health better than it had been in decades. I worked and saved money, putting aside funds for Liam's release, preparing to help him rebuild. I visited him monthly at the federal facility where he was housed, watching him mature from teenager to young man behind bars. He used prison time productively, taking college courses through correspondence programs, reading extensively, planning for his future after release. The tech industry had become aware of Liam's case through media coverage of the trial. What emerged was an unexpected conversation about ethical hackers and the desperation of medical debt. Several cybersecurity firms reached out expressing interest in hiring Liam after his release, seeing his skills as valuable despite his criminal record. A nonprofit organization focused on healthcare reform started using our story in their advocacy work, pointing to Liam's case as evidence of systemic failure that pushed people toward desperation. Liam was released after serving 4 years with good behavior credit. I picked him up from the facility on a cold morning in November, and we drove home mostly in silence because there was too much to say and no way to say it all. He'd been accepted into a cybersecurity firm's training program for released offenders, a position that would let him use his skills legally while completing his supervised release requirements. The pay was decent and came with health insurance, benefits I'd never had in my entire working life. 6 months after his release, Liam sat me down and presented a financial plan he'd developed during prison. He'd calculated that between his new salary and careful budgeting, he could pay back the restitution to the companies he'd defrauded within 10 years. He wanted to do it faster if possible, wanted to clear the debt and move forward without that weight. I watched him explain the numbers with the same intense focus he'd had at 12 years old, the same determination to make things right through sheer force of will. Now it's been 3 years since Liam's release, and he's thriving in ways I didn't think possible after prison. He's become a respected security consultant, helping companies identify and fix the kinds of vulnerabilities he once exploited. He's paid back 40% of his restitution ahead of schedule. He's 27 and dating someone wonderful, building a normal life that seemed impossible during those dark years. My cancer remains in remission, 5 years now, better odds than anyone expected. We live in a decent apartment without black mold, and for the first time in my life I have savings and security. Liam kept his 12-year-old promise in ways that nearly destroyed us both, but somehow we survived the cost of love when society failed to value life over profit. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.